Welcome back to Class 4 of People's Planning Academy 2.0. I don't know if Class 3 is fresh in your mind, but I thought Class 3 was kind of fun to watch you all act as transportation planners. Did you guys have a good time doing that? Seeing that everyone navigates the city in a different way, and so that has different implications. The city doesn't have the same infrastructure across the city. Some communities have sidewalks, some don't. Some communities have bus lines. Some people have history of interstates dividing their communities. So so that was good to watch you guys, and I hope you learned a lot from that. So in this class, we're going to take a different approach. I would say a deeper dive into transit-oriented development. We're going to go from what that looks like on the ground to the philosophy behind transit-oriented development, what that is, and what it could look like for the city of Indianapolis. So tonight we have three great speakers. We have Daniel Hedgeland, who you guys know from a variety of classes that he's led this academy. So he's going to talk about transit-oriented development. He's from our team at Department of Metropolitan Development. We also have Brooke Thomas, the strategic planner at Indigo. We also will have Katie Robinson, the director of the Office of Sustainability. Katie will be talking to us a little bit about how transit-oriented development works with a broader plan for sustainability and addressing climate change in our city. So I look forward to hearing them and the conversation that comes about from these presentations. So I guess I'll go over a brief agenda, or Daniel, did you want to do the agenda? All right. So we're going to start off with providing you the fundamentals of transit-oriented development. And then we're going to go into the current policies and what the local ordinance looks like as far as TOD. And then we're going to talk about the equity piece when it comes to transit-oriented development. And then Katie is going to come in and talk to us about Thrive Indianapolis, which is the city of Indianapolis's sustainability policy. And then we're going to talk about what you can do moving forward. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Daniel to talk a little bit about the fundamentals of TOD.
Hey all y'all, thanks once again for coming out tonight and coming to hear us speak. I know it's cold, it's getting dark earlier, but it's very appreciated to have you guys here, and I'm excited to talk with you a little bit about what is TOD. And I feel like this is a word, like an acronym, that in some ways can sound a little intimidating. It sounds very government. But transit-oriented development, or TOD, is a type of urban development that includes other amenities integrated into a walkable neighborhood and located within a half mile of quality public transportation. These areas tend to be diverse and mixed use, and successful TOD depends on access and density around transit stations. And even then, that description still sounds pretty plannery. So let's talk a little bit more about what TOD looks like and what it feels like. And I want to start with a quote from Jarrett Walker. He's the president of Jarrett Walker and Associates. He's a leader throughout the nation in transit, and he help us rethink some of our transit strategies here in Indianapolis. And he said, all transport is development oriented, and all development is oriented towards some transport mode. If you want that mode to be public transit, then you need to plan development, not just its layout, but also its location, with transit in mind, just as all urban planning did before 1945. That's all what the term transit-oriented development says, and all that it should mean. So we hear TOD, we hear transit-oriented development, all these big words, but trying to break it down simply, think about places as they relate to transit. And so we've started with text, but sometimes pictures can be more effective than text. So what is TOD? TOD is a mix of land use activities. We've already mentioned this a few times, but it's worth repeating because it's important. It's a mix of homes, offices, public services, shops, and restaurants. They're all close together, and they can be integrated either vertically with buildings with multiple stories, or horizontally with having housing next to offices and restaurants and retails, all within a very close proximity. And for TODs, kind of one of the key features is that all of these things are located near a transit stop or transit station. So a TOD is a mix of housing options. And these are pictures from Indianapolis. This isn't somewhere else. This is from Indianapolis. And a mix of housing options also includes mixed income, including accessible and affordable housing. And it also means preventing displacement of renters and property owners whose income is lower than what the market is attracting to an area. TOD is pedestrian scaled environments. That includes active street fronts. And active street fronts is a term that you're going to hear planners say, and all that means is like when you're walking down the street, there are people there, there's activity. It actually feels like people want to go to these places. It's building entrances right along the street as opposed to pulled way back. And parking to the side or behind the building so that like the building and the people, they're put first. TOD is a walkable environment, and that includes streets with wide, unobstructed sidewalks that are in good repair. TOD is a connected street network that is a tightly woven street network where it's easy to get around by foot or by bike. TOD is public services and amenities. And that means around these transit stations, there's access to parks and playgrounds, in addition to access to local services. TOD is homes near businesses. That's so that like the homes and businesses are close together and homes are close to shopping and entertainment. Where you live and you work and you play are all in a close place. And that's beneficial because that makes it easier to walk from your home to these places, and that gives you extra activity, but it also means you're spending less time in some form of transportation, including a car, so that you're spending more time doing the things that you want to do and with your family than necessarily on your way to do those things. TOD is degrees of intensity and density. And so that means incremental increases in residential density and non-residential intensity. And that's what that means is like near the transit station, that means trying to have more people in close proximity to all these parks and services so that more people can enjoy these things that are developing around the transit stations. And all of these photos have been from Indianapolis. And like these photos here on the screen right now, they are, this isn't some sort of distant concept. These are places, there are already places in Indianapolis that you could call TOD. Many historic streetcar suburbs in Indianapolis can be described as transit-oriented development, in that they often include a distinct activity center where people once boarded the train, surrounded by walkable blocks that connect seamlessly into neighborhoods. So whether it's on College Avenue, whether it's near Fountain Square or Irvington, there are places in Indianapolis. It's not like we're trying to transport some sort of idea and just like force it into Indianapolis. This is stuff that has existed. These are places where we live here in Indianapolis right now. So how can TOD be beneficial? We've hit on some of these basic concepts kind of leading up to today, but there are a number of different ways, particularly for people like individuals, like mobility for non-drivers. Those too old, too young, banned, or facing a disability that prevents them from driving experience major isolation. They make 15% fewer trips to the doctor, 59% fewer trips to restaurants and shopping, and 65% fewer trips for social, family, and religious activities than drivers. And think about that from your own personal perspective. If your car is ever broken down, then it's harder to get out and do things. And like, imagine living that everyday life. That's a challenge. Employment. About 59% of transit trips are trips to work, and businesses located on transit routes have significantly less employee turnover. Indianapolis currently ranks 64th in job access via transit. So that's something that we want to think about and work on. And also upward mobility. Only about 1 in every 20 kids born in poverty in Indianapolis can climb to the top of the economic ladder, making Indy one of the least upwardly mobile cities in the United States. We're 46th out of 50th. Transit-oriented development allows low-cost access to work and schools. And there are even more reasons. Yep.
Could you repeat the last thing you said?
Yeah, I can. So, only 1 of every 20 kids born in poverty in Indianapolis can climb to the top of the economic ladder. So, if this is something that you're interested in, we are pulling this from a fact base, and I can help get that information to you. Yeah, no problem. Economic growth. Investments in transit typically generate $3 for every $1 invested, but it can be much more. Cleveland's Euclid Avenue Health Line generated $114 in economic development for every dollar invested, and they were able to leverage their investment to nearly $6 billion in development along that corridor. In Cleveland, we're not talking about East Coast, West Coast, we're talking about Cleveland. Housing, affordable housing, near quality public transit is in high demand, even in bad housing markets. During the Great Recession, residential values performed 42% better when they were located near high-quality transit service. And then finally, household savings. Indy households spend about $12,000 per year on transportation. This is one of the highest transportation costs in the nation, and on average, households in, quote, transit-rich neighborhoods save $6,000. Healthcare costs may also decrease too, with improved access to biking and walking, which can lead to improved mental and physical well-being. So, we've seen what TOD means in Indianapolis currently. We've talked a little bit about some of the benefits of TOD, and now I would like to turn it over to Brooke Thomas, the strategic planner with Indigo, to talk a little bit about how do we design TODs.
Hello, everybody. First of all, I'm extremely excited to be here with you tonight. I'm a guest of the City of Indianapolis Department of Metropolitan Development, and I recognize some really friendly faces from the days where we worked on Indy Rezone together and planned 2020, the bicentennial agenda. So, hello, friends. How do we design? I'm going to do a little callback to your Zoning 101 class. These are what we think are kind of the most critical characteristics. So keep each one of these in mind as I do a little bit deeper dive on some of these topics. And Daniel's already kind of hit on it as well. I'm certain you talked about it in your walkable neighborhoods, your last class, but a mix of diverse land uses, mixing those housing types. The idea that maybe you can have your very first apartment, right? And then maybe the next neighborhood over, the next street over, that's where you buy your first home. And you could live in the same kind of community or the same area throughout your entire life. And to the extent that you have children or other relatives that want to live near you, to keep those people close, right? Highly walkable. You guys got a good healthy dose of that at the last class. The areas that we're going to talk about in terms of TOD, right? Like the whole corridor, the whole street doesn't have to necessarily be designed with this, hyper transit in mind, but we're going to talk mostly about that immediate station area. So the intersection where the bus station is really what we're talking about. It's critical. It's kind of Indianapolis's beachfront property, if you will. And then around how we support that quarter-mile radius during the walkability class, did you guys talk about kind of what a comfortable walking distance is to and from a transit center, right? So we're still kind of in that space even tonight. The immediate station area, so these are the buildings that come right up to that intersection. Some of it is the buildings along the corridor. The uses, the high performing uses are those land uses, those businesses that have a high degree of turnover, if you will, right? So kind of somewhere you could quickly grab a bite to eat at lunch as opposed to like a long sit down dinner. Somewhere you're dropping off kids and picking them up on your way to and from work. So those places that have a lot of activity, a lot of turnover, people are kind of going in and out all day long, and maybe even more so during certain parts of the day. the immediate station area as well. Speaking of kind of that activity on the street, there's a lot going on, and you can have facade elements, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, and right-of-way characteristics that make that a better experience as you're kind of running into people, and maybe not literally running into people, but passing by people, right? So which is easier to pass maybe a mom in a stroller that's also got, a child that's walking down the sidewalk, if the sidewalk's 3 feet, right? Or if it's 8 feet, which one's more accommodating for those types of interactions?
Well, if that was the case, if I had a bunch of chairs and stuff, taking up most of the sidewalk next to the transit station.
Yeah, did everybody hear this gentleman's comment? I think what you're referring to is sometimes the businesses that have a whole bunch of tables and chairs and maybe like a fence that juts out clear into the sidewalk, and now you've got even less space to move.
It narrows down to here.
Right. So this is exactly the space we're talking about.
Restaurant shingle, and then the seating area that's all fenced off, and you wouldn't want that next to what's going on there.
Right. And Daniel showed you a picture of one of those, right? Yeah. All right. So the public-private space. This is where, the public space, the road right-of-way, but also the sidewalk and the sidewalk cafes and the entrances to buildings. This is where it meets kind of what are essentially private spaces, right? Places where people might own, or it's a business that you may or may not frequent, right? It's something that somebody owns. There's a lot of things to balance and where this public space meets the private space, and oftentimes we're trying to accommodate semi-private and semi-public, right? Like this is where we meet. This is where a community meets. If it's not in a church, right? Like it's in these places. So we have, in planner terms, most likely landscape architecture terms, hardscapes and softscapes, right? So bushes or fencing or like low walls or stoops to homes, those things that kind of start to define where those spaces are. Kind of one of the most important elements, and maybe sometimes the kind of forgotten element, is what we call the street wall. So this, the front of the building, right, does the best job of defining kind of where this public space stops and where the private space kind of starts. It's what forms, a phrase I heard and I want to continue to use it, is the three-dimensional right-of-way, right? If you've heard the term right-of-way or used the term right-of-way, a lot of people are like, oh, well, that's the road and then the sidewalk, right? So take those sides of the buildings, those fronts of the buildings, and go up. And now you've got like your outdoor room, right? So like the three-dimensional right-of-way. Sometimes there are really wide streets, and street trees can be used to kind of be the other wall, if you will, on the other side of the street, to kind of box that in and make that feel a little bit more inviting or safer. Return to that kind of outdoor living room, if you will. And there's an example of that. Here's this word facade again. So facade variation, right? So that front of the face of the building, the part you see from the street. We have had historically just multiple buildings that kind of try to cram into like a block and make for a really interesting experience. How many of you have ever walked past kind of a large industrial building that takes up the whole block and there's not a single window to look inside or look out of, and then kind of contrast that to this picture? Which one offers maybe a little bit better of an experience? Which one feels safer? This is what we mean when we say vary those building facades. This could very well be one big building, right? But at least from the outside, it has the appearance of kind of matching the scale of you as the pedestrian, right? Like some of us are really, take up a lot of space because we're just energetic, right? But the buildings can really dwarf even kind of the most boastful people, right? Here's another kind of example. We're trying to show you these sketches. Daniel showed you a lot of pictures that one kind of demonstrated we have transit-oriented development already, right? This isn't a new concept. This isn't foreign to Indianapolis at all. I'm trying to kind of revisit some of those and show you some images because we have the ability to what planners call codify this, take what we like about the built environment and then put it into the zoning code so that when a property redevelops, that property owner or developer, or whatever the case may be, has to take some of these things into consideration. And so this is how we would present what we like about transit-oriented development and start to write it in terms of these are actually requirements. Transit-oriented development, there will be some elements that really kind of need to be uniform, and then also allow for flexibility and creativity so that there can be some uniqueness. And I'll just give you some examples. Something that might be uniform is that whatever the building use is, whatever activity is happening there, whether it's a grocery store or a daycare or a doctor's office, that doesn't so much matter, but what we want to do is have all those buildings right up against the sidewalk to create that wall, that street front, right? So the setback, we call that the setback. The heights, right, can be uniform. And then building materials, just generally speaking, could be uniform. And then some of those uniform streetscape elements. So the benches are all relatively the same, or the trash cans or bus stops, right? Some things that can be unique where we would want to encourage people to be creative would be the architectural style or some of the details they might put on their building, the colors they choose, where they locate the entrance, the heights of the windows, the size of the windows, those kinds of things. Speaking of front doors, I mentioned that there's, where the public space kind of meets the private space, and sometimes it's semi-public and semi-private. Where this front door goes and like how high it is off the ground is really all about privacy, right? That's why you see maybe a residential like townhome, they've got a stoop, just a couple of stairs to step up into their place of residence, and maybe the windows are a little bit higher and there's some bushes out front or a little courtyard. Like they've just designed that in such a way that it feels like you go from that highly public, right? There's a lot of people out there into my private space, as opposed to maybe a doctor's office, or I guess Goose the Market just jumped into my head. I don't know why, but you can walk right into the front door, like right off the sidewalk, right? Past a couple tables and chairs. Let's see. Signage matters. I think this could be an entire class if you guys really wanted it. The scale, right? If the buildings are scaled to the pedestrian, and a lot of those amenities are scaled to the pedestrian, and even the trees are kind of scaled to the pedestrian, right? We want the signs to be scaled to the pedestrian. How big a sign is and where it's placed. If it's just talking to people walking by on the street, right? It doesn't have to be big and high. Those are for people on highways, right, in cars.
Does that also include making sure logos are not oversized? Like the Tide dry cleaning place that's got this huge orange sign.
It can. Prominence, right? A sign's prominence. Signs are intended to do different things. Some signs are quite literally landmarks, right? Like you've arrived somewhere when you see this marquee or you see this monument sign, right? And then others are just flat out for commercial advertising, right? Like this business here. So signs have all kinds of different purposes, and even, signs as public art. Courtyard, green space design, and the requirement to have some sort of outdoor space. Some of these parcels can be really small in these areas, right? Because they were established a long, long time ago. And so to maximize how much land is there, property owners, and we would want to maximize, we want to leverage how much of that property gets built on, but then also still have enough space for people to move around. So courtyards can be shared spaces, like if it was an apartment building, right? This could be all of those tenants, backyard or front yard, however you want to look at it. They can also be public or private, right? So a courtyard could be shut off to residents only, or it could be something that is incorporated so that it's really inviting for the whole community. There's a degree of functionality that we want out of these spaces, as well as, I wrote down programmability. I don't know if that's a word or if I just made that up, but functionality and programmability, like that there aren't these just kind of voids that kind of have no purpose whatsoever. They can sometimes attract not good things, right? So if you use all of your lot for your building, you can still gain some outdoor space on a rooftop, and to make sure that we allow for that. Again, this idea of going vertical with transit-oriented development, there's a lot of opportunity to do that, and there's a lot of reasons why we would want to do that instead of having everything kind of be low to the ground. Back to streetscapes. Are there any landscape architects in the room? That's okay. So if I was a landscape architect, I'm not. Don't even play one on TV, right? But this could also be its own presentation or topic. But this idea that there's all these elements that you could put into our public space, the place where we meet with one another, and we would want them to be complementary and not kind of conflict with one another. We would want to be mindful of how big our outdoor cafe is. But this can really, really enhance the experience of a transit rider, right? If you had somewhere where you could rest with your groceries before you got on the bus, or with a child that's acting up, right? Give them somewhere to run off some steam before you have to get on your ride. Public art. Opportunities to add points of interest, culture, history. Talk about that sense of place that's there. I'm going to pause here because I take kind of a turn for the last part of this. So imagine we've kind of done all of these things. You could see how if a developer was required to kind of take these things into consideration when they make improvements to their land or their property, that you might actually get some of those images that Daniel showed you, right? So we've just attracted a lot of people to these places because they're really exciting. We've probably also attracted some cars, right? Some people are going to get to these places by car. So let's talk about how we accommodate the car. Curb cuts. There's often a desire to limit the number of these or kind of make them behave. Who's ever kind of helped somebody in a wheelchair or rolled a stroller or been on a bike or rollerblades, and you are going along the sidewalk and it seems like every 2 seconds, you're down and you're up and you're down and you're up, right? So those are what I'm talking about when I say curb cuts. They also introduce places where cars can turn and come and go from, right? So conflict points with pedestrians, and they can really kind of interrupt the pedestrian flow, if you will, especially if there's a side. I keep coming back to the sidewalk cafe. He's over it, but This is an aerial view then. So imagine you're trying to walk around and you've got to kind of leapfrog wherever the yellow gets broken up because there's a street or a curb cut, right? These are the things we navigate as pedestrians. Structured parking, verticality again, right? Like getting as much on a parcel of land, getting kind of as much on a block as we can, and attracting as many activities and people as is reasonable for whatever that place is. Structured parking is certainly a lot more than just a surface parking lot. I think the estimate was it's about $18,000 per space. Imagine that, right? We can have a more efficient use of land by stacking the parking on top of one another. It's just pretty costly to do. And even when you stack it, right, if you're going to have that active street front, you're probably going to want, at a minimum, kind of an active ground floor. And then other places go so far as to kind of tuck the structured parking behind buildings, right? Like wrap it with buildings from ground to ceiling. What's that? Texas donut. I'd never heard that before, but that is exactly what that is. So these are just some other things to think about. Another thing that planners and even maybe traffic engineers are thinking about is there's a way to build a parking garage, a parking structure, so that it could potentially have some future life other than a parking garage. I think it's cross dock, right? When you drive in and the floors are just doing this like all the way up, there's a way to build them so that those could eventually maybe be turned into housing units or offices. So other fun considerations like that. Here are two local examples. The one on your left, I believe, is Cosmo, the Cosmopolitan by the canal. Can anybody confirm that for me? Nope. Then it must be true. Oh, okay, we got one. And then the other one is Cityway. I was blown away. Does anybody know where this parking garage is? It's the Market Street garage. I was blown away when they built what I assume are condos in what was a tiny strip of grass right next to the parking structure. But this is a really good example of how they wrapped at least that facade with an active use, right, where there's people, not just cars. I couldn't believe it. And then lastly, just a call back to public art. Obviously, Eskenazi Health, right? They knew that they would have this parking garage that faced the community, faced the neighborhood, and a lot of consideration went into how do we put our best face forward, even if it's a parking structure. One final note on surface parking. We cannot ever forget about on-street parking. I think on-street parking kind of gets overlooked, right? Like there's so much parking right at the street, right at the front door where a lot of people want to park and just run in and grab something. So there's on-street parking, and then there's also the parking lots, and there's a lot that you can do to put parking to the side or to the rear or even wrap it. Is that still a Texas donut? Sorta. We'll have to think of another Danish, right? But kind of so that the parking is out of the way. Still accommodate the vehicle, still accommodate those trips, but put it kind of in a place that doesn't detract from everything we're trying to do on the street and in our three-dimensional living room. Yeah.
What are reasons that structured parking would not be required? Like where people would be allowed to go out instead of up?
How do I say this? There's not a lot of communities that are successful in requiring that parking be structured. It's often the developer or the property owner's choice whether or not to do that. Would you, anybody want it to be an absolute requirement? No.
I just have a question about transit-oriented development, and why are we even worried about parking garages? Why don't we just get rid of them? Like, I live blocks from the red line. I would love everybody to ride the bus. You know, and I think we can encourage it by limiting the parking options. Let's get cars off the streets.
So there are some ways that we can reduce the amount of parking and make sure that these areas that are much more dense, much more intense, right? This like rich like city fabric, offer developers and property owners the tools that they need to not have to put in more parking than they need to, and offer them support in, historically we've required them to overpark their properties and not given them credit for having on-street parking or access to other modes of transportation.
I think the city can enact,
Do more?
they can do more to encourage it. You know, there's that street park, I live in Fountain Square. I'm about 3 blocks from Fountain, so you know, I'm pretty close in, and, my God, on the weekends, I mean, it doesn't bother me, I ride my bike almost everywhere. However, I would not move my car out of my parking space on the street in front of my house on the weekend for this, because I will never go to park.
You'll never get it back.
Because they give so many bars and restaurants, you know, variances on the parking requirements, so that everybody's pointing over to neighbor's residential street.
Yeah, can everybody hear her? She's talking about what often happens, especially like in really successful downtowns or villages, cities where, you know, that aren't Indianapolis, right, but are on the coast, is that people that are coming to businesses will often spill over, even if there is on-street parking, and even if there is parking at that business, it's often not enough, right? And so the automobiles will spill into the neighborhood, and then the people come home from work or come home from getting groceries themselves, and can't park anywhere near where they live.
I see a time coming where we're gonna go, like on my block, we're gonna go for resident-only parking.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's pretty harsh, but looking for people to find some other way to get around.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think the city needs to do stuff to, you know, to really get people on board with using mass transit. It's not just about neighborhoods and the cars everywhere. It's about the fact that the housing crisis is real. We really don't have until 2050 to turn it around. So, I mean, that's one thing the city can be doing right now.
I love that you get that, and you're gonna hear from Katie before the night's over about just some of those topics. But I wanted to see, did you have a question or a comment?
Well, I'm closing on house on 38th Street.
Congratulations. She's buying a house?
But I will not be able to park in the house.
No.
Because I live right in front of Crown Hill. And,
Right.
I mean, nobody will ever park in front of the house.
No.
So what about things like that? And, you know, it's that thoroughfare is a highway.
It is, it absolutely is.
So, you know, there are places where the traffic pattern is not going on.
Yeah, so I think what, so she lives in an area or is moving to an area where there really isn't a lot of places to put or store a vehicle, even if you live there. So I think what my last comment, and then I'll turn it back over to Daniel, is just like, you know, the sidewalk has to accommodate like people walking by one another. Like we really do have to figure out that balance between, you know, helping businesses thrive and like letting people kind of get to them, letting people get to and like park at their house if they need to, right? There's a lot to balance in everything that we've shared with you tonight. Certainly everything you guys have learned in class to date, but this is the balancing game.
Brooke?
Yeah.
You could mention that your rezone did change dramatically.
We did, yeah.
Parking requirements to accomplish what this person is hoping.
Yep. So we did. We need to do more.
There's another factor though, for some developers, it's not so much a choice whether they want to accommodate the vehicles it's put on them by their lenders. Their lenders say they have to accommodate a certain number of vehicles. So there's that aspect to it as well.
So as part of the Blue Line TOD planning grant project that Indigo and the Department of Metropolitan Development are partnered on, we have the resources of the Urban Land Institute that just did a study on that exact topic, which we can make available to everybody here. You might be surprised. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Daniel, but if you guys have any questions, or I'll be here after class as well.
Okay, so we've seen what TOD maybe means in Indianapolis, what exists. We've seen kind of examples of what maybe guidelines for TOD maybe they look like in the future. So let's talk a little bit about why do we need to act now? And this is a very colorful chart that shows a percentage of what's called high-risk land within 400 feet and within a quarter mile of proposed transit stops on the red line, the purple line, and the blue line. And high risk indicates land that is zoned for uses that are not traditionally conducive to TOD, including automobile storage, gas stations, vehicle sales, rental and repair, parking lots, and drive-throughs. Once again, thinking about Indianapolis as a large place, these uses all have a place here in Indianapolis, but also think about some of the designs that we talked about. And some of these uses maybe aren't a great fit right around some of these transit stations. So
Body shops, parking lots.
just a number of uses that, if you're walking by, maybe they don't necessarily enhance your trip to places. So that's things that we're thinking about. And as part of our early analyses of our zoning code, as part of kind of the process we're going thinking about TODs, is some of the things that we've thought about is that, generally speaking, around a lot of the transit stops, we can build TOD, but you don't have to. And right now that there's a pretty heavy focus on uses, and this is pretty common throughout the United States, whereas there's very little regard to size and impact of development, whether it's a 2,000 square foot grocery store or a 50,000 square foot grocery store. It's a grocery store, and it is or it is not allowed. The rules in place make providing a variety of housing options challenging just because of how technical things like setbacks and building height and distance between buildings, they are very conducive to things like single-family housing, but sometimes there's mismatch in the places where we would maybe be thinking about other forms of housing and the rules that allow, or they maybe sometimes can make it challenging to build these other forms of housing. Also, the zoning code doesn't really address this, what Brooke was talking about, the street wall, or just some of the public realm. It does a good job on parcels, but kind of outside those parcels, it's somewhat limited. And as we talked about all the way back in the first class, that zoning works well for individual sites, but it doesn't really talk about how things fit together to create a place. Places can happen by accident, but are there things that we can be doing to try and help guide and help create places somewhat proactively through things like our development ordinance? So the next thing that we're going to talk about is equitable TOD. And this is an exceptionally important part of the TOD. Things that we're thinking about and kind of the process that we're using to move forward. And at this point, you've been to 3 classes, including a kickoff by Joe Minakazi. And while TOD is a healthier and more sustainable way of building cities than auto-oriented development, TOD can also be a driver of displacement, reducing a neighborhood's affordability and resulting in advantages that cannot be enjoyed by existing and long-time residents. TOD can also bypass entire communities that have quality transit infrastructure in place, but even though they have this infrastructure, they receive little or no attention from anchor institutions, developers, and traditional public and private investors. So TOD can be a catalyst for displacement. Markets in different neighborhoods behave differently. And for areas with strong markets, TODs can be a catalyst for displacement. And that's important to say, and it's important to think about. It's also important to talk about the dimensions of displacement. There are a number of different ways, a number of different things that can lead to displacement. And in neighborhoods, historic patterns of racialized disinvestment are causing depopulation and displacement, particularly of African American residents who leave their neighborhoods and relocate, sometimes outside of the city or the state, often in search of greater safety and access to opportunities and services. The Center for Community Progress found that 30% of population live in declining areas. These people are losing services, they're losing safety, and they're also losing equity. So there's this displacement by disinvestment. There's also displacement by gentrification. In other neighborhoods with accelerated real estate markets, people of color, especially those of lower income, are displaced by development that causes rents and property taxes to rise, making neighborhoods unaffordable for local residents and businesses. And the Center for Community Progress also found that about 17,000 Indianapolis residents, which accounts for about 2% of our population, live in gentrified neighborhoods, mostly in and around downtown. It's also important to remember the effects of displacement. Displacement produces and is exacerbated by low indicators in health, climate resilience, and cultural vitality. Perhaps the starkest of these is the average life expectancy, which in some majority African American communities can be more than 15 years lower than in majority white communities. So these are important concepts to think about. And going back to what Joe Minakazi spoke on in the first kickoff class, just the idea that the development that we have ultimately has costs. And whether it's when we initially build the road, we're not done. We have to go back and we have to rebuild the roads in the future. We have to rebuild, we have to do constant maintenance to things like parks and to all sorts of services and infrastructure that we have in the city. So thinking about the kind of challenges and costs that we have all throughout the city, but also thinking about how redevelopment and gentrification can affect people is an important part of the conversation that we are having. And here's a graph that shows preferences by housing type and location. And in this graph, you can see that younger generations have a built-in preference for places that are close to a mix of uses. That convenience shopping and what planners call third places is another semi-technical planner term. But what that means are like restaurants, bars, libraries, parks, places that aren't your home, that aren't your work, that you go and you meet people. And if you can just look at this chart, you see the blue lines are people under the age of 35. They have very strong preferences for city mixed use and city residential. And that city residential is going to be the neighborhoods that are very close to downtown. They also have this suburban mixed use, very strong preference for people under 35. And so why does this matter? Those are people entering the housing market today. And a lot of people can be like, yeah, well, millennials, they're this anomaly, they're kind of weird, they don't fit with what people have traditionally done, and maybe they'll eventually kind of kick back. And that's maybe true, but there is this kind of what my former boss, Brad Bobian, calls a unicorn type of neighborhood that is the most popular regardless of generation. And it's highlighted here. It's this mixed-use suburbs where, regardless of age, people are very interested in being. And these are statistics. These aren't national statistics. These aren't from a different city. These are statistics that were produced based on Indianapolis by MIBOR. So this reflects our local community. And what it shows is that these suburban mixed-use places like Broad Ripple, Irvington, Carmel City Center, and the Nickel Plate District, there is demand for these places today, and it doesn't have anything to do with transit. This isn't something that's caused by the Red Line. This is something that is naturally happening here in Indianapolis. So this takes us to this chart, and it shows how land is and how it compares to walkability and TOD in all of Indianapolis. There are over 400 square miles of land here in Marion County. And currently, there are 5.25 square miles of what are called walkable places. These are places with walk scores of 70 or greater. That's about 1.3% of the county. 1.3 is a pretty small percentage. And with BRT stations coming online, we have about 14.5 additional square miles in the quarter-mile radius around stations. This is net 17.4 square miles minus land already walkable, those are the green sections, in parks, floodways, or airport FedEx station. So 17.4 miles square miles out of over 400 square miles. That's a very limited amount of area. And consider the area with the most important impact. That's this area that's within 400 feet of the transit stop, where it's super easy and it's very convenient to be able to walk to transit stations. That accounts for about 1.25 net square miles. That's about 0.31% of the county. That's an exceptionally small number, 0.31%. And this land is precious. I think Brooke talked about how we don't have any sort of ocean, we don't have beaches here in Indianapolis, but in a lot of ways this is our beachfront property. Looking back at the graphs that we just showed, there's a lot of demand for this area, but a very limited amount of land. So these are the places that are likely going to have to absorb all of that market demand, which in turn creates affordability pressures. So I have talked a lot, Brooke has talked a lot, we haven't had a lot of engagement today. Question for you, what happens when demand exceeds supply? Yeah, prices can go up, because there's more people that want something than is available, and so that can push the prices of things up. And so nationally, 60% of people will pay a little to a lot more to live in neighborhoods within walking distance to parks, shops, and restaurants. And here in central Indiana, 28% of people want something besides a single-family house, but 90% of new construction are single-family homes. So going back to all these statistics we talked about over the past 5 to 10 minutes, this can help show why thinking about affordability now and thinking about it proactively is very important, because a lot of people want very mixed use and land that's very, and houses that are close to transit, but we just don't have that much of it. So TOD can be a catalyst for displacement, but equitable TOD we think can potentially be part of that solution. So let's talk a little bit about a case study where there have been other cities that have been working on TOD, and they have also seen similar challenges with affordability. Some of the same stories that we're seeing could potentially arise here in Indianapolis. And one of those places is Chicago, not too far away. And now, first and foremost, I want to caveat that Chicago is a different place than Indianapolis. And also, some of the transportation and transit that they have is different than what we'll see here in Indianapolis. But they have faced challenges. They recognize that their development patterns, they needed to think about populations around kind of these transit stations. And they've also faced challenges since they've started taking action. And it's super important to make sure that we are learning some of the lessons that they are facing so that we can be thinking of them now. So rather than facing the same problems, we can potentially be proactively working to try and see if we can't start at a higher bar and address some of those challenges that Chicago faced early. And there's this quote: Chicago region has been recognized as one of the most segregated and inequitable metropolitan areas in the country. And this is the result of a century of racially motivated investment, disinvestment and wealth extraction, and intentional separation of communities. For decades, Chicago's built environments, including housing, transit, highways, universities, and healthcare campuses, have been used to disconnect, exploit, and segregate communities rather than uniting them. Residents still endure the legacy of these decisions, perhaps most urgently in the form of displacement. And Chicago is one of the most segregated and inequitable metropolitan areas. Just everyone should keep in mind Indianapolis is number 11 in the most segregated cities. So this is an important part of our conversation. Yeah.
Who said that?
This quote, I believe, is from Elevated Chicago, the statistics on number segregation.
Of the majority of the cities with the largest African American populations, the city of Indianapolis was ranked number 11. And I can tell you this is pulled out of a study that Elevated Chicago used to inform their ETOD policy. And I can share that with you all.
Well, I saw that down there. I just didn't know if that's who did the study or what they want to do.
And that is something that it's exciting that you all are interested in it, and that is something that we can provide some of this information from Elevated Chicago so that you guys can also kind of dig deep into and be able to read, learn, and talk about. So, Elevated Chicago is a partnership of organizations committed to transforming the half-mile radius around transit stations into hubs of opportunity and connection across the Chicago region's vast transit system. And they helped develop this definition of kind of equitable TOD. And in their definition, they say it ensures that a more vibrant, prosperous, healthy, and resilient community, connected to opportunities throughout the city and region, may be enjoyed by all residents, and in particular, low-income communities and residents of color, who stand to gain the most from greater prosperity and connectivity. So, just to give you guys an example, this is ETOD is a development strategy that focuses on areas around transit stops as places to invest in small businesses, housing, public art, green infrastructure, and other assets, with the hope of retaining residents and improving their quality of life. Elevated Chicago began its work at strategic locations along the Green Line, Pink, and Blue lines of the Chicago Transit Authority system. These locations represent a spectrum of market conditions and equitable development opportunities, from rapid gentrification to stark disinvestment. As a result, in each of these communities, for all their differences, they share a common present. People of color are at a higher risk of displacement from these areas. So leaders from the communities where these stations are located are part of Elevated Chicago's steering committee and community table and help guide the work which happens within a half-mile radius of each transit station. So what does this look like? Once again, we're trying to less text, more pictures. And we've talked a lot about what buildings look like. But this is an example of what ETOD looks like around a station in Chicago called Bronzeville Cookin'. It's a unique dining destination and culinary incubator celebrating the cuisines, cultures, and communities of people of African descent at 51st Street and the CTA Green Line. And so from the pictures, they're maybe a little washed out due to the lights right here. We can see a copy of the PPT. But basically what this is that there's public art. There are community meeting places. There are businesses and incubators that are all trying to work with existing businesses and elevate the existing community rather than trying to bring ideas and art from other places, build within the community. Also, other examples of ETOD projects include The Hatchery, a nonprofit food and beverage incubator dedicated to helping local entrepreneurs build and grow successful businesses, and affordable housing preservation at 63rd and College Grove, led by the Preserving Affordable Housing. So the ETOD and equitable transit-oriented development isn't necessarily just rules. It isn't just buildings. It's people, and that's an important element to keep in mind. So Chicago's TOD ordinance, first enacted in 2015, allowed developers to increase density and to reduce the number of required parking spots for new housing near transit stops. As those projects moved forward, there were increasing concerns about displacement in low-income communities and communities of color, particularly in areas where upscale TOD projects meant less affordable housing. In late 2018, the mayor's office in Chicago approached Elevated Chicago, this coalition of organizations, to help shape the city's TOD ordinance update. In the update, the city wanted to expand the definition of transit to include several busy bus routes, something that we're thinking about here in Indianapolis, and sought Elevated's input to ensure equity and community support. And while Elevated Chicago was more than happy to help, it also had an ask for the city to add an explicit racial equity lens to the ordinance, addressing the risk of resident displacement that can occur with TOD and the depopulation in bypass neighborhoods. So what does that mean? We're going back to text. But we're going back to text because it's actually part of the ordinance. The result is a rule that explicitly calls out equity, an ETOD ordinance. Unlike previous versions of Chicago's TOD ordinance, the new legislation explicitly mentions TOD as a strategy for increasing racial and economic equity, and stated goals, actually goals that are in their ordinance, include avoiding displacement of residents, small businesses, cultural institutions, and community organizations, and encouraging investment in communities of color and low-income communities and appropriately addressing various market conditions. And so, once again, this is Chicago. And as we have pointed out, and we all somewhat laugh, Chicago is a different place. But we are taking steps to try and think about equity here in Indianapolis. And part of that is Indy's Equitable TOD Fund, with the goal of this TOD fund to preserve or cause the development of 1,000 affordable housing units within a short distance of a transit stop in a way that is consistent with neighborhood priorities. And it enables equitable access to jobs, education, healthcare, and more. And this idea for Indianapolis' ETOD initiative originated through the Greater Indianapolis Progress Committee's Collective Impact Plan 2020 vision process. So these are things that we need to think about. These are things that we are thinking about, but these are part of the conversations that we will continue to have in the future.
Can I add, how many are familiar with Indianapolis's ETOD fund that we have?
Can't hear you.
The question was, how many people are familiar with or that know that there's an equitable TOD fund? So this is really important, yeah, right? $15 million to buy property and hold it and make sure that what gets built is at least in part permanent affordable housing along Indianapolis's frequent and rapid transit lines. It's a big deal.
That's $50 million that's going to be spent by the government, or?
No,
It's being spent, has been spent?
buying, yeah, through a partnership with INHP and Signage to buy and hold it and put restrictions on those properties so that there is permanent and affordable housing units along Indianapolis's transit corridors.
This is purchased similar to land trusts.
It's a different vehicle, and we can get you more information on what it is, but
Yeah.
it's an important part of our solution set in all of this. So.
So which property?
They're along the red line and blue line corridors right now.
And
So they've
purple.
been- Yeah, sorry. They've been acquiring properties along all three of the corridors.
We can get you more information.
Yeah.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, so is this only empty lots? Because what about the houses that were already there? People that were already living in those neighborhoods that have been there, but now as gentrification, these people are moving back down here and put a $700,000 house next to my $50,000 house, and my taxes go up and I can't afford to live here anymore. Is that going to help me stay in my house, or I'm still required to move? But you're gonna buy up my property now?
Oh,
So
no,
it's
we're not buying
affordable
people's
now?
homes. Nope, not buying people's homes. We will definitely get you more information. Yeah, after this class.
I was gonna say, is there a website?
Yep,
Okay, so we just Google ETOD fund?
yep, we will send out all the information.
What impact do you think like the lack of the presence of emissions from our rapid transit buses has on equitable development? Because like one thing that happens in neighborhoods that are car centric is quality of life goes down and health goes down because of pollution. So is that something that you guys intentionally did? Or
Yes,
what
and
do
we
you
can
think?
talk about the electrification of buses, but this is actually a really good segue to Katie. So I don't know, Katie, you wanna come on up? We introduced you earlier. Yeah.
Super odd. Well, now I'm like really here.
Hi, Frank.
Hi, how are you? Okay. Hi guys, I'm Katie Robinson. I am the Director of the Office of Sustainability for the City of Indianapolis and Mayor Joe Hogsett. Hello, it's good to be here tonight. Let's see, all right. Thank you for having me. Part of what our office has undertaken in the last couple of years is Thrive Indianapolis. It is the city's first ever Sustainability Resilience Action Plan. It is indeed a comprehensive citywide plan designed to measure our emissions and waste, analyze city services, and develop strategies that will create a more resilient Indianapolis. The changes that we're experiencing, that we are already experiencing in Indianapolis, are adding stress to our infrastructure, potholes, city services, and to our residents. As our environment transitions, so must our city, and Thrive Indianapolis actually positions us to do just that. So how do we define resilience and sustainability? Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly and continue to have opportunities to thrive in the face of challenges. And sustainability is a state where we are meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of our future generations to meet their needs. And in this effort, our intent throughout the planning process, the community worked with our team to develop 2 overarching goals. The first being to increase community resilience by prioritizing equity in policy, planning, and project implementation. And the second was to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So in 2017, March 1st, 2017, the mayor and the council both passed Resolution 21, passed and signed Resolution 21 that commits the city of Indianapolis to being carbon neutral by 2050. So our framework is relatively simple. There were 8 elements to Thrive that cover the key systems in the city. Every plan element has 2 goals and a set of actions to achieve the goal. In fact, we came up with 59 actions at the end of the planning process. Thrive Indianapolis addresses 8 focus areas. For instance, the built environment, which allows us to design the places we build, enabling us to succeed from buildings and neighborhoods to utilities and streets. And transportation and land use, which I know you guys have all been very embedded in throughout this process. That means for us, cultivating the opportunities and places necessary for our residents to flourish. The plan evaluated city and county policies and services available to community resources and residents' needs to develop priority actions that benefited all. Certainly, the future holds unforeseeable events, which is why we need to learn as much as we can from our past and develop a plan that will allow us to overcome whatever the future holds. Thrive Indianapolis is an actionable plan that addresses these current and future threats and vulnerabilities and prepares us to bounce forward through the challenges that we may face. I always say bounce forward, not bounce back. We want to make sure that in whatever we're facing in the future, we're always bouncing forward. We're better than they left us, right? So one of the key takeaways from Thrive, it was actually the component, if I may, that I nerded out on the most, was a climate impact and social vulnerability assessment. It was the first that we've ever had for the city of Indianapolis. We took 12 socioeconomic factors to better understand what social vulnerability looks like in our community. So you'll see a lot of colors on these maps. The one on the left is indeed our social vulnerability index. I am going to try. But pink is areas of greatest sensitivity or vulnerability in our communities. Blue obviously is a little bit more stable. And then what we did with the social vulnerability assessment is we started to layer on top different types of climate impacts. So this one is your summertime maximum daily temperature, so it's days above 95 degrees. And so this gives us a sense for what you might have heard of as the heat island effect, the urban heat island effect. And now what we're doing on top of that is there's some purple boxes around those deep red areas, and that is again layering social vulnerability on top of that. And what it allows us to do is make key primary investments on things like cool roofs or green roofs, or just really understanding some of the issues that are faced in some of those areas in particular. Let's see here. So what does climate change look like today in Indianapolis? We've already seen a 2.2 degree increase in average annual temperature. We're expecting 10 to 15 additional days over 95 degrees that's projected by 2050. We have already seen a 16.1% increase in annual precipitation since 1950. And we've already seen a total volume of rainfall increase since 1981 of 4%. So I know that's really overwhelming. And you might be asking a question of, okay, all right, so what is Indianapolis doing? Things came together really well for us in the last year. And once we passed Thrive, we also were able, very fortunate to be a part of what is called the American Cities Climate Challenge through Bloomberg Philanthropies. We've come a long way in the last 4 years in particular, but once we were selected for this cohort, we are one of 25 cities in the U.S. to participate. It's a 2-year acceleration program with powerful new resources and access to cutting-edge support that we otherwise would not have had access to. It will allow us to beat our near-term carbon reduction goals. So what does that possibly look like? As part of the challenge, there are 8 actions. So 8 of the 59 in Thrive Indianapolis rose to the top. Bloomberg and the Natural Resources Defense Council asked us to focus in the areas of the built environment, energy, and also transportation. And so these were the key actions that we felt like were doable in a very short amount of time. Let's see, now we have about 14 months left in the program. So things are really kicking into gear. We're looking to, over the next 14 months, add some renewables to our municipal footprint. So transitioning how we are powering our system as a municipality. The Energy Resource Center is something that's sort of in the process that we are developing in partnership with Indigo and a variety of other components throughout our community. It'll be potentially a mobility hub, a resilience hub. It could be a variety of things. We're going to let the community help us design this center. Energy benchmarking. This could be a more transformational goal for us. It's a bit of a moonshot. We're really looking forward to seeing again how the community allows us, actually works with us, I should say, in developing this particular goal. Transit-oriented development, I know you've heard a lot about that tonight. And then we have an EV suite of options, or actions rather, that really focus on educating people on what their options are as it relates to electric vehicles. And lastly, working alongside Indigo and Brooke as it relates to equitable transit. And that's all I have. I know that's a lot of information in a really short amount of time, so I want to leave plenty of room for questions.
Actually, we can. Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, sure.
I would like to
have a
invite
question.
everyone to, all the speakers to come up and open this up for questions in general. I know we only have a few more minutes left in this class, but I want to make sure that your questions are answered. And there's a few things that I've made note of that you want to make sure that we provide you with additional information. So you want more information about the similarity index study that we talked about that had like the segregation numbers, as well as more information about the equitable TOD fund that INHP is leading. So I made note of that. I will get that information to you. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question for Katie. I participated in the Thrive Indianapolis, well, somewhat. I mean, I made a lot of comments on the,
Thank you.
the draft plan. And all of that stuff is good that you just presented, as well as the plan itself. But when, say, your boss wants to throw all that out the window and do some things that, well, throws all that out the window, how do we hold, as happened in my neighborhood, how do we hold you accountable?
That's fair. That's a very good question. So there's a lot of opportunity in this next term for us to think about how sustainability is positioned in the city of Indianapolis. The mayor and I have talked about a variety of ways to do that, whether we continue, so financially we're embedded in the Department of Public Works. So we do report to the committee, the council.
I was thinking about DMV, but yeah, either or.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So in terms of the City County Council, we report to Public Works Committee, and then also to the Public Works Board. So that is like technically how we are held responsible at this point. And the good news is that the public is very interested in sustainability issues, and so it's really hard for us to get away with much right now. And I love that, and I really appreciate that. I love how much people are engaged in these conversations. We need you to continue to be involved in prioritizing these issues, because this will affect all of us. There is not someone that will not be touched by these issues moving forward.
Well, just quickly, I mean, so, departments are little fiefdoms, and, you've got political appointees and stuff like that, your boss, for example, or DMV's boss. So how do you make sure that all of that is instilled and written in stone, all your goals and policies and all that in these departments, so that they're all, all the time, consistently?
So our office was established in 2008. It started with an executive order under Mayor Peterson to establish a green commission, and that's essentially how the Office of Sustainability was born. So there is an executive order for the establishment of these issues. I don't know that the terms have changed. I mean, they have changed. It was Green Commission, it's Office of Sustainability, and now we're moving more into resilience. Like, I mean, we're all just having all sorts of fun with the terms. So, I mean, I don't have a good answer for your question other than, I mean, I'm pretty sure that you all voted on Tuesday, and that is the number one way to hold all of us accountable for the work that we do. Yes.
My question is, you've got this red line, and you guys keep touting it and the blue line that we're facing on the west side and stuff. You can't even get the red line up to operation or to running, and you're talking about putting the purple line in and the blue line in. Why don't we get the problem straightened out before we advance further in this? I mean, we need the public transportation, but we don't need something that's going to be scrapped in 10 years because we put all this money into it and no ridership that they're facing now. The ridership is down way.
So I'm going to interrupt Brooke, even though she's here on behalf of Indigo, but because we're celebrating the bus rapid transit system as part of the American Cities Climate Challenge, I will say that it's been extraordinary to see how ridership has been on the red line. I think everybody would acknowledge that we've got a little bit of work to do, but we've seen over 200,000 riders take advantage of the red line since it opened Labor Day weekend. And the most phenomenal thing about this entire system is that it's electric. So somebody was asking about pollution earlier. Indigo is making phenomenal investments in terms of sustainability, and I really applaud them for that effort. So I will let you address
So
it.
I hear your question and your concerns, and happy to look at ridership numbers in a more detailed basis, but we're committed to making the improvements that we need to make on the red line and having purple and blue be successful, as well as increasing the frequency of the frequent network as well next year. So more to come, more to do.
I would also say, as a community, we've already voted that we'll spend this money, and we want to, part of the process is like starting something new and learning from it quickly. And also part of it is like things like the purple line, the blue line, it takes a long time to do the planning and design and building and beginning operations and ramping those things up. So part of the continued process is making sure that we are actively trying to make sure that this money that people have voted on, we're using it proactively, we're using it smartly, but we're also like thinking out blue line, we're several years out in the future. And so I would say that we're learning the lessons that we can and moving forward.
And one of the reasons I was so excited to be here tonight to talk specifically about transit-oriented development is there's such a strong connection between, even a road, right, and its adjacent land uses, and the success of not just the red line, but the purple and the blue will be in part by the land uses that it serves. So if those land uses are self-storage or gas stations or some of those more auto-dominant uses, that absolutely will impact ridership. So as those property owners elect to redevelop them or improve them in ways, we just want to make sure through transit-oriented development that it's contributing to the success of our transit network.
Do you have a question? On the EVs, I haven't seen any type of offers or incentives or education anywhere.
So I failed tonight. I have a really delightful pamphlet that I normally take with me, and I normally have a small 6-year-old that then passes it out. Yeah. Today it broke away from me because she's now sick. So I apologize. What we can do is make sure to send out an electronic copy. I would love your feedback. It's a 101. It is coming from the basics, because even when I took this position, it was a little intimidating to start talking about electric vehicles, right? Like, there weren't very many on the road 3 years ago. We've seen an increase. There are about 800 electric vehicle owners in Marion County. We know that we need to see an increase. In order to meet some of our carbon reduction goals, we need to see an increase. However, there still needs to be some financial incentives. So our office is taking a look at that and seeing what's realistic for our community. And I don't yet know what those are going to look like. We've got 12 months, right? It's going to be a busy year. Yes.
Well, I brought this up last time because I was here on a Saturday.
Okay.
in addition to incenting people to buy the vehicles, I think there needs to be incentive also to know how to retrofit old houses to
Totally
efficient
fair,
vehicles.
yes.
And as a follow-up to that Saturday, I called, sister, whoever, and they were not very helpful at all. I was like, I got an old house, I need wire for this and that, and they were like, good luck, call an electrician. But, having the information at your fingertips and motivation money-wise to make it more cost-effective, in fact, to plug them into my house. I didn't find any service or help in that, or information in that.
That's really great feedback. So in our 102 brochure, as we continue to add more information, I like that. I like the idea of,
Registration as well.
yes.
Yes.
Fine.
Yes.
So it's a fee, and the issue with that has to do with gas tax, right? So if you choose an electric vehicle, you're not then paying a gas tax. So, but we still though have to make sure that we're getting funding for our infrastructure. That's the tiny hiccup that we have in the system.
Yes,
So,
exactly.
Just want people to mind.
I wanted to go back to the public transit piece because can you truly account for the success of the red line so far if it's been free this entire time? So of course 200,000 people or however many people have been on it. So I'm just wondering, have you been able to truly account for its effectiveness? And then to the point of fixing the current system, if you're a person that lives on the far east side, say at 42nd and Post, which I did for quite a few years, I could not access Pendleton Pike without a car. That has not changed and will not change with the purple line. So to me, I'm just like, what's the point?
Right. So there will be parts of Marion County that will need a different mobility solution than rapid transit, for sure. And then back to your first question about ridership, I don't think that there's anybody at Indigo that harbors any delusions that this is what we could expect or this is what we're doing going forward. We know that to get a true sense of the success, we need much more time and past the point of paying, right? Like we need to get through kind of the cold season. Transit has some seasonality to it, right? That can impact ridership as well. So not just when we go live with the paying, but all of the other things that we take into consideration when we look at ridership. So we didn't mean to kind of present the numbers that we have seen in the month of September as, yay, we did it, right? Yeah. The story will be told over time. And it'll go way past when we start collecting fare.
yes.
So, a couple things. I want to make sure the narrative is correct because the narrative keeps saying that we voted for what Indigo is proposing. We voted to have money spent on rapid transit. All right. We didn't vote on the details of no left turns, getting rid of the local buses. So I want to make sure everybody understands that, and because that's very important. Because with transit-oriented development, you can't look at it as a vacuum of we're just developing a station and what's good for new development. You got to look at old development, like if you had 38th and Emerson, you got houses. People spread out on the houses. If you just have a station at 38th and Emerson, and then a person on 38th and Wallace has to walk 2 blocks to get to 38th Street, and then another 2 blocks to get to the station, then transit-oriented development is only there for new development. It says the heck with development that's been in the city for 50 years. So transit-oriented development, I understand we're talking about new development, but at the same time, you got to realize we got to couple this with existing development that's already there, because otherwise it's not fair. So when you add a rapid transit, but you take the local routes off, then you're saying forget about the development that's already been there. People that built their houses 50 years ago and could just walk 2 blocks to a thing. Now you got to walk an extra 2 blocks to get to it. And when you're talking about seniors, because the thing showed who would live close to if you've already bought your house and you're seniors or you're a young family with little kids, or you're disabled, you're asking us to buy another house by this new transit development instead of you saying, let's couple this new transit with the existing needs already. And so I'm saying Indigo has forgotten that, and so that's a big problem.
But one point of I hear you. One point of clarification. None of this is to suggest that Indigo, as a municipal corporation, is going to be building transit-oriented development. So I think that's an important distinction. But your explanation of what's existing brought something else to mind, and that is that we have entire communities and entire intersections that are already transit-oriented to transit supportive. The current zoning ordinance, if for some reason something were to happen to that property, it were to burn down, for example, the laws of the land for that piece of property would make it really hard, if not impossible, to put back what is there. So some of what we're talking about when we're talking about transit-oriented development is protecting and enhancing places that are already supportive of transit. And I think that extends to some of the neighborhoods as well. Anything we can do to strengthen the street grid or the pedestrian connections from within inside a neighborhood to the transit center and making, or to the transit station, and making whatever it is that they're walking by safe and accommodating and comfortable. That's really kind of what we're talking about. But I'll look at that intersection specifically.
No, I'm just talking about,
Yeah.
I was just saying about the distance.
Yeah.
4 blocks, a quarter of a mile is okay for a young person in their 20s or 30s. But you're not thinking about seniors, disabled, or mothers with small children.
One thing that
We are, because I am one.
one thing that I don't know if you remember when Austin from Indigo came, he mentioned that the BRT is just one element of a broader countywide plan. So the missing piece that could help address your concern is the frequency grid. So, and Brooke, you may be able to talk a little bit about that. But I think that's an important element. So right now we have majority of our transit routes are 30 or 60-minute routes. So next year?
June.
Yeah. Next June, we'll now have, I don't know what the percentage
More
is.
15-minute or better routes.
Yeah. To you know, combine with the BRT. So if that makes sense. We have a question, or two more questions.
You talked about adding a frequency, but how many lines are being dropped? Goes back to the areas that are being totally neglected because they don't fit into your design of your Thrive Indianapolis and your TODs, because they're outside, that they don't look like those areas that you're now working on. So instead of own areas, you're increasing bus lines to make them fit or connect to the red line. You're just dropping them lines altogether. So what about that? We don't care about increased frequencies to other lines. Is where we live at. Now, if we live in our own bus line, what good is the red line and how many other lines you gonna add? We can't get to them.
What, can you tell me what route specifically?
Number 5 and 28.
The number 2 will also be removed from the library.
Removed or, and replaced, or removed altogether? So some of this was part of the decision to go from coverage base to ridership base, but it wasn't necessarily because of the red line, so to speak. But I'm happy to kind of take your comments and maybe have somebody from Indigo follow up with your concerns specifically.
I think you need to start looking at neighborhoods more about the routes that they're changing. I know a lot of people who have been car free for a long time
Mhm.
intentionally and have lost access to their bus. And that's just wrong. Indigo needs to be working with existing route riders before they eliminate them and help work out solutions before they take those routes out.
I can't speak to the specifics because it was before my time at Indigo, but there has been extensive outreach and communication across all of Indianapolis, Marion County.
Exactly.
But not eliminating routes. All that, I went to a bunch of those meetings. None of those were about eliminating routes.
Exactly.
So I'm happy to kind of have a side conversation about Indigo, the service. Was there any other additional questions or comments about how we ensure that the development that's adjacent to transit is supportive of it?
So I guess it's kind of a couple sustainability question. When you develop these, like all these new apartment buildings that are going up and whatever, a lot of them are like short lifespan buildings, and they use like parts that aren't necessarily repairable, right? So like they have vinyl windows, we got to replace the whole thing. It's petrochemical, and like so all of the mass that goes into the building has to get there somehow. So what are we doing to like mitigate the effects of, not having reusable materials or repairable materials in buildings, and how do we get better at, like, I guess, moving the materials to the buildings? How do we make that more sustainable? What are we doing in that area?
That's a really great question. Unfortunately, we're not able to have in place a building code that's more aggressive than the state's building code. It doesn't mean that we're not thinking about ways in which that we can work with the state or make sure that we do have a building code in place that allows us as much wiggle room as possible. The piece that we're looking at right now with business and neighborhood services is actually how, so for instance, when there is a significant renovation or demolition that's happening, is how do we think through how that material is recycled. So we haven't quite gotten through the movement of material, so if something's being constructed or renovated, how that material is being moved to that location. But we're trying to think through how can we possibly reuse material. There are a lot of pop-up, I might call them pop-up organizations, but again, Indianapolis is great for its entrepreneurial spirit. We're fortunate to have organizations that will come to such a demolition or whatever and try to take material and then reuse it, and make wonderful, incredibly artistic things that we all would have in our homes. So there's a lot of ways in which we're looking at it. Unfortunately, we don't have a tremendous amount of wiggle room because of how we're set up as a state. But thank you for the question.
Thank you all for your very thoughtful questions and discussions. I'm really excited that you guys are so energized about this topic. I feel like it's been a success in my mind that you're thinking so critically about these issues and the impact that transit has. I'm really excited for Class 6, where we're going to really delve into what you can actually do and resources that are available to you as far as things that you can do in your community. But then also, I remember someone asked a question about accountability and what that can look like. So stay tuned for Class 6. I'm excited for you guys to be equipped with those tools. And then also, please mark your calendar for November 19th at 6:30. We're confirming a location, but this is an opportunity for you to provide your feedback on what transit-oriented development could look like in Indianapolis. So mark your calendars. We'll send you more information about this date, but it's a community workshop, and we want you to be our community experts. You have received the information. You have unique information about each of your communities and your personal experience. So mark your calendars for that, and then I look forward to seeing you all next week when we'll talk about Development 101. So thank you all.